chromosomes that are used in bacteria and yeast fairly commonly, and there is work into artificial chromosomes for humans. It's very early days, but here are examples of, you can see the artificial chromosome there in red. This is from a paper in Gene Therapy. This is all not in human beings, but in human cells. And the idea would be that if you took that and you had hundreds of years of dedicated research to perfect it, to make it safe, to figure out what genes you wanted to put in that artificial chromosome, it is at least reasonably possible that we could all look like a combination of John Hamm and Superman. Which would be great. So I was really in Doom's corner at this point in the movie, and then this happened.
It's choosing, John. It's choosing who to infect.
Choosing? How's it choosing?
There are genetic markers for psychotic and violent behavior. It could be a specific neurotransmitter it's picking up on. A ganglion, latching onto numbers in the DNA code linked
to what? Evil?
10% of the human genome is still unmatched. Some say it's the genetic blueprint of the soul. Maybe C24 is what destroyed the population. It would explain why some of them had to build the ark to escape to a new beginning. Some it made superhuman, others monsters.
Okay, so at this point, not so big a fan of Doom as the first part. Mostly because of this, and I wanted to make this really clear. When we talk about science fiction has the opportunity to warn us about things that could go wrong. And I think that that's critical. That's something that science fiction can do very well. So I'm not saying that whenever there's an application of biotechnology that goes wrong in science fiction, that that's a bad thing. But if you look at this is one that we know is already wrong, right? We know that there is no 10% of the human genome that contains the genes for evil. We know that there is no single nucleotide that makes people bad or psychotic, even The Rock. So the reason why we found this so interesting is this is one of those examples that we think distracts, right? Science fiction has this great opportunity to point out things, real things that could go wrong. So we want to avoid pointing out things that we already know will never go wrong. An example of a better movie in this respect would be Gattaca.
Her faith in God's hands right from those of her local geneticist. 10 fingers, 10 toes, that's all that used to matter. Not now. Now, only seconds old, the exact time and cause of my death was already known.
Neurological condition, 60% probability. Manic depression, 42% probability. Attention deficit disorder, 89% probability. Heart disorder, 99% probability. Early fatal potential. Life expectancy, 30.2 years.
Gattaca is a little too specific in this case, because if you say that there's a 42% chance of manic depression, you probably should also mention that that's different from a 41% chance of everyone else who doesn't have this genetic profile. So the statistics make this sound a lot more specific than it actually is, but the ideas that are being brought up here, you know, how do we deal with genetic information? How do we, as a society, work to use this information in a reasonable way? These are the kinds of questions that we're really interested in science fiction, educating the public and reminding us of, the people that are working in the field.
I think the nice thing about Gattaca, too, is that he doesn't die at 30, right? And again, sorry if I just ruined the movie for somebody.
I'm trying to get really old ones.
You know, they're specifically taking an example that is a little overblown in society. People think that you're going to use genetic screening to tell exactly what's going to happen to you in your life, and you can give a probability on it, but even then, it still might not happen, right? There's still the 1% chance that it won't happen. So it's good to keep that in mind and not sort of resign yourself to your genetic fate in some sense.
Can you talk about for a second where the title Gattaca comes from?
You know, I didn't actually look that up. I mean, obviously the G-A-T-H.
I think it's just a combination of the letters for DNA that sounded cool.
Right.
So last, before we move on to the panel, chimeras. So when most of, well, let's be honest, when my family asks me about chimeras, this is what they're thinking of. animal-human chimeras, combinations of human DNA and animal DNA. And when I think of chimeras, this is what I think of. The mouse on the top is unmodified. The 2 mice on the bottom have been modified with a single human protein that affects their coat color. Generally, they do not grow wings or start talking to you like they would in Douglas Adams' book.
Now, I do think when George Bush had the chimeric ban, he was probably thinking of the image on the left.
That is entirely possible. So, our interest in science fiction, me specifically, I've been an educator for over 10 years, is that I think that it has really wonderful opportunities to inform the public and to sort of make the people that are working in academia and industry consider the ethics of the work that they're doing, which is why we think that it's so critical that the science be as accurate and as interesting and as relevant to not just what we do in the lab, but relevant to society as possible. And I think that you can do no better for science fiction folks than Ron Sterling. So I think I'll just leave that one up there. Anything you want to say? No? So we have a couple of copies of our book for the first people with questions. And if you want to get them signed, just come on up after we're done. But we would be happy to take questions.
So I was watching an episode of V the other day.
Episode of V?
V, yes.
Yes.
And they were talking about how the visitors were harvesting DNA from the humans because they left out some of the DNA from their own code. It was just the sugar phosphate backbone, and it was horrible science. And I, as a grad student at UCSF, you know, my roommates and I were all just screaming at the TV. So that being obviously a huge program on ABC, do you feel that science fiction, especially stuff that's on television and in the movies, is still kind of on track with the science fiction made in, you know, science fiction taking scientific ideas and trying to make them, you know, more accessible to the public? Or do you feel that it's starting to become more absurd, the stuff that you would see on it?
I don't think anything is starting to become more absurd. I think there's always been a tension. I mean, I love fantasy. Like, I love pulp kind of science fiction novels that, you know, are obviously making no attempt to be hard science fiction. The ones that get me worried are the ones that sort of verge into both territories, where they'll have enough right to sound plausible so that when they diverge, you actually need a lot of specialist knowledge to realize, wait a minute, that's a little tricky. I haven't actually seen V. Don't? Okay. I saw the old one, and I guess I kind of liked the lizards eating us as opposed to lizards stealing the DNA. Yeah.
I tend to find that you will get the good examples where people are trying really hard to keep the science real, and then I think there's a lot of examples where some writer saw this somewhere and said, I could make a really good plot point out of that, right? I could write an episode around this, but I don't necessarily have to stay true to the science, and I think that happens a lot.
And I should also say, really briefly, that I think that as scientists, one of the things that we can do is sort of make ourselves available, that when we're talking about the science in these plots, but the writers had some specific goals, right? You know, they wanted the aliens to want something from human beings that they had to take. They wanted it to be something visceral, right? They're stealing our DNA. It's kind of the job of the scientific community to be available and say, maybe we can accomplish the exact same goals in the plot in a way that's a little less goofy. And I think that's something that, you know, we could do a better job of.
If you want to just come up and get your copy.
Right now?
Yeah, so we don't forget.
So we don't forget, because we only have so many.
So on, we were watching the trailers to Source Code last night. They're actually kind of pushing the source codes a little bit more based on reality. And you guys said before, transfer of consciousness isn't really kind of possible, but that's the whole premise of source code. And I think there's a famous Japanese physicist scientist that's also been consulting to the guys at source code. He was in the trailers as well. What's
I don't remember his name.
Machi.
Really cute Japanese guy, long blonde hair, or gray hair.
Long gray hair. I'm totally blanking on his name. Starts with an M.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
So he was saying that the consciousness transfer could be possible.
Well, could be possible. I mean, I think that we're very far away. I mean, obviously moving a cursor on a screen is quite different. And I believe, and I want to be cautious about this, that the source code waves the magical quantum wand. That if you say quantum mechanics, it may be really weird, but it's technically possible. I don't know because I haven't seen it. So I really can't say. I do know that there are scientists that are working on whether there are quantum mechanical effects on molecules that would affect neurons in the brain, and potentially whether quantum mechanics is required to explain parts of consciousness. I think that work is a little bit out there, but it's not completely out there.
Terry and I were also discussing something right before where I really would need to go back and look up the source, but I believe, and if I'm wrong, but I believe there was this guy who implanted this device in his own muscle that could basically read the electrical impulses going through his muscle, and he could send these signals, or basically replicate the signals, send them to another device, and have that person sort of do the same thing that he was doing. So he'd move his arm, they'd move their arm. That type of thing is relatively feasible. The electrical impulses going through muscle are not that complicated. The brain is a lot more complicated than a bicep is. So again, it's one of these things that you don't want to say it's impossible to transfer consciousness, but it's going to be really complicated.
Usually they say something like quantum entanglement, which applies to, you know, two particles, not two people. So.
Particles is super collider.
So do you think the advancement like of nanotechnology, I don't know how far advanced nanotechnology is, going to influence biotechnology in the sense of being able to build unique and new novel genetic code, or manipulate living genetic code?
Nanotechnology already influences biotechnology a lot, not necessarily in the way that people are always thinking about it, but just by being able to scale things down and making things on a really small scale, you can manipulate cells and molecules much more efficiently than you can at a macro scale. So in terms of building new DNA molecules, that's sort of a specific application. Nanotechnology can do a lot in terms of not just building DNA, but sort of arranging cells, organizing molecules. I work for a company that makes devices that are intended to regenerate nerves for people that have severed nerves in like a car accident or something like that. And part of it is nanoscale signals that tell the nerve where to go. So people don't always think that's the type of nanotechnology that we're using, but there's a lot of things you can do with nanoscale.
So it's more of looking at nanotechnology, not being a little machine, but
right.
looking at things on that scale. A nanoscale.
Yeah, I mean, there is the possibility for nano machines too. I just wanted to sort of emphasize that just being able to work on a nanoscale is a broad thing.
Yeah, and I would say nanoscale, nanotechnology, you've all got some. I mean, a cell or a protein, these are exquisite nanomachines. I mean, a protein is capable of performing very specific chemical reactions. A cell can replicate itself. Basically, the simplest bacteria you can think of does pretty much anything that science fiction has said that nanomachines could do. And it's one of the, I used to write a column for IO9, and there was the question of gray goo, will we create nanotechnology that will just sort of reformat the entire planet? And my opinion on that is if it would have already have happened, bacteria would have managed it at some point.
Bacteria did manage it at some point for 100 years. Just following up on the V question.